A very good evening. How are we today? I am well too. We're nearing an end, and now we're going to try slow things down a bit, and perhaps allow a bit more reflection. I suppose the 3 days has been too compact. So we'll slow it down a bit and allow a bit of reflection. Deliberately, I postponed discussions so that at least we'd have the basis for discussion, so that we don't discuss from, just from our pedestrian ideas about what happens in society. So before we get into today's subject, which is language and decolonization through the perspective of a Kenyan writer called Ngugi wa Thiong'o, let's try and address some of the questions that we have been postponing. One of which was, what was the relationship between what we did yesterday and student protest? And then the other question linked to that was, what do we foresee the year, to look like? Now, see, the question, what will the year look like in terms of student protest, when it was asked, it struck me as a very typically South African question. It's a typically journalistic question that journalists would ask at the end when they haven't really found an explanation for what they are trying to understand. So at the end, they would say, so where do we go from here, or where to from here? The question or the point, as Ngugi says, in one of his novels, is not to look at where we fell. We must look at where the rain began to beat us, not where we tripped and fell. Because, the question where to from here wants to then negate how we got to where we are. The answer to what will the year look like is self-evident if you think about what is the cause of these student protests. So the answer would simply be, have the underlying factors that have led to these student protests been addressed? Now, if they have been addressed, then there's reason to then say that, well, it would be expected of the students to now return to class, not disrupt, classes and not disrupt the academic year. But if the answer is that structurally everything remains the same, and in fact, if there is not even an intention, there is no sign of an intention to address the things that led to students protesting, then the answer has to be that the protest of necessity have to continue. And I suspect that as someone who lives and works here in this institution, there is very little that has changed since the students started protesting in 2015. One doesn't find in the institutional culture, one doesn't find in the structures of power, one doesn't find in the curriculum any movement from what was the situation in 2015. I often ask in my department, which is the Department of Politics, that you would expect that it would have, perhaps better than any other departments, the answers to the problems that the institution is facing. I often ask my colleagues, what has changed in the way in which you teach political science today and the way in which you taught political science in the 1980s? Absolutely nothing. It's the same thing that they taught to students in an institution that was exclusively white, that was racist. It's the same thing that they teach today. So, why would the students then have any reason to look forward to a peaceful academic year? So we have not given the students any reason to not want to disrupt the academic year, because even the attitudes, now what is even more worrying at UCT and in other institutions is even the attitude that one gets in response to these student protests. The first response, knee-jerk response that people give to this protest is to mount what they think is a moral high ground and begin to point a finger at the students. How could you destroy, these institutions? Don't you have a sense of appreciation of what these institutions are doing for you? Now, that actually is to rub salt to the wound. For me, as a black person in this institution, if you ask me, why don't I appreciate this institution? You're asking me to appreciate my oppression. You're asking me to appreciate an institution that alienates me, that culturally is pointed away from me. So if you ask me that I should appreciate the institution and therefore a peaceful academic year, you are basically saying to me, I should be complicit to my own oppression. I think there is a better way to attending to people's worry about the university system in South Africa. That way, I suspect, and it's my opinion as someone who's been to many of these institutions. I spent 4 years at VETS. I spent, almost 2 years at UCT. I've been at Fort Hare at the then University of Transkei. So I have a view of black institutions, I have a view of white liberal institutions. I also have a view of Afrikaner institutions. So I know the South African higher education landscape pretty well. I think that what will help in salvaging the higher education system in South Africa is, one, a realization by everyone who lives in this country that the us and them divide will not help anyone. For anyone to continue to stand on the high moral ground and say that, well, in our time it was better, in our time this wouldn't have happened, the point is that we live now. So there is another sense of apprehending reality, which is what we can call the survivor's justice. We must just realize that now we all live here in this society. And in order for us to be able to live here, we must recognize that we all have to recognize that this place, in fact, is not a society. This country is not a society. There are things that happen in a society. There are things that don't happen in a society. Things that happen here don't suggest that this place is a society. In a society, you can't walk by when a person is dying. In a society, you realize that that's a human being. You cannot just with a clear conscience walk by when the next person is dying. Those things don't happen in a society. This is a place where you find people who, in the way in which they behave, just say, unfortunately, we happen to be here together. They despise each other. Now, what needs to happen in order for the higher education system to survive is that we all have to recognize that we all live here, and in order for this place to be livable or habitable, not just for us, but for generations after us, we all have to accept that we have to give something in order for this place to function. We cannot think that we would hold on to our old positions. Remember, the positions we occupy as white people, as black people, were created by a colonial racist society or regime. So if we want to hold on to the positions we occupy, we want to hold on to the positions that were given to us by colonialism and racism. We have to move off from the positions that we were put on structurally by colonialism and racism, and accept that there has to be a mutual trade-off, between all of us who live here. Because, as I was saying, just before the class started, the difference between South Africa and America where often people think, oh no, you can continue, with racism and subjecting black people to structural racism. The difference between South Africa and America is that in America, black people constitute between 12 and 18% of the population. In South Africa, black people constitute 86% of the population. When a time comes that black people are so fed up with this system, there is nothing that can stop them. In their sheer numbers, even if you short them, in their sheer numbers, when they say, this place, living here is no longer palatable, there's nothing that can stop them. Remember, at that point, law will not be able to protect anyone. So this fantasy about the law today, at that time, the law will not stand in front of people when they say, but we cannot continue living the way we are living. At that point, unfortunately, we would then realize that there was a missed opportunity in the past, and I think that opportunity is now. Now, as someone who's pretty involved with the students, I do know what the year is going to look like. Deferred exams are being written now. Registration will come, would allow students to register and get residencies because we can't protest with them not having accommodation. So we need them to get accommodation and be on the ground, and then we're going to start protesting again. So the year is not going to take off. And we're going to continue doing this up until this society recognizes that for us, saving the year does not change our condition. So suppose UCT continues to function, would the condition of black people change? It's not going to change. So what interest do we have to allow the system to continue functioning? Because the system itself, the university itself, reproduces that inequality in society. So we do not have that interest to let the system function. So we're going to protest, and there is an interesting trend that we are noticing. It is that many institutions that are able to balkanize themselves and call on private security think that that's the route to take. So you have Stellenbosch, recently followed by Wits, because they are Wits' fans, so they've also turned themselves into an army garrison or a police garrison. Now this is what will happen. Over time, as we protest and we're defeated at Stellenbosch and at Wits because of this, there is a moment at which we would break that security. It will not prevail for the next 10 years. At a moment when it breaks, there will be no possibility of negotiating at that point. There will be no possibility of sitting around the table and working out what is the most appropriate way to change the institutions. Trust would have broken completely between those who are protesting and those who are protecting these institutions. It's the same thing that happened to apartheid. It balkanized itself, or it securitized itself over time, but it got to a point where that could no longer work. Now, it's the same thing that is going to happen to these institutions. At a point, this security is going to break, and when it breaks, how are those who over the years have employed these security forces going to look us in the eye and say, well, we can negotiate? At that point, the tempo of the student protest would have to change. The language would have to change, because as I think that there would be at that point a complete loss of trust and a possibility of negotiating in good faith with those who would have employed over the years security in order to repress. Because what they are repressing is our will to be free. So their attempt to repress our will to be free and resorting to security to repress our will to be free, at that point we'll tell them what you were doing, you were not just repressing a protest. you were repressing a people's desire to be free, a people's desire to live in a society that acknowledges them as full human beings. And so I think that those who today do have the power would do well to recognize that, it's in everyone's interest. It's not in the interest of black students, it's the interest of everyone that, we negotiate in good faith and change fundamentally the structural, design of our institutions. So I think that, and last point, then, we can open it up for a bit of a discussion. The interesting thing is that, you see, with universities, the white society has been able to let every other sector collapse. So the dysfunctionality of the police, you turn to private security. The dysfunctionality of public health, you turn to private health. Dysfunctionality of every other social good, you can turn to the private. The good thing with higher education is that you cannot turn to the private. Here, we are in it, all of us equally. Here, it has to work for all of us. Because, as the government has said, for instance, it's not ready to legislate private medical schools, thankfully. So, it means that the higher education is one sector where we're going to be able to bring white people and black people to realize equally that in this society, if it has to function, we both, have to give something to its functionality, or rather, that we cannot turn to alternatives. Because, education, higher education, unlike primary and secondary education, you cannot have your private schools. You cannot have private universities, like you have private schools and high schools and primary schools. So the point I'm trying to make is that higher education is a good indicator that we all have to make it work. Money is not going to save anyone in this instance. Even if you have money, you cannot go to a private university. You won't find any. In fact, the few that have tried to exist in South Africa, we know that they are substandard. You can go to Monash. You would know that they are less than the high schools. Their value is less than the high school. So that's the good thing about higher education. It's a clear indicator that privilege has limitations. There's something else that is needed to make societies function. It is that all those who live in society must recognize that society is as a result of a collective effort given equally. So I think that's how the year is going to go. There will be protests now. And after some time, probably after 2 months, you must not get me talking about protests because we lose time. You see, the good thing is that UCT is a clear indicator of how we are going to finally break the higher education system in South Africa. UCT is starting its academic year now in March because it lost 2 months last year. So it means that this year UCT cannot afford to lose another month because it has pushed too many things from 2016 to 2017. It has pushed, so this year is pegged for the university. So another month of protest at UCT means we have to cancel this academic year. There would be no option but to cancel this academic year because if we get another month now in March, we're starting the year already in March and we've eaten into the June holidays in order to make up for the time, and we've eaten into the end of the year holidays in order to make up for what we lost last year. So if we lose a month now, perhaps we still have a month somewhere this year, but it means that no holiday altogether. And then when exams are about to start, we're going to start again protesting. And then we lose another month, there's nothing left. So people can then at that point realize that this is a very serious matter that deserves serious attention. Mounting a moral pedestal and pointing fingers is not going to help. We need something else in order to save this place. And so once UCT loses the academic year, the question would be, how do we resolve that? How do we get out of that? So it's either that the university writes the academic year off completely, or no one has a single holiday this year to try and save it. But yeah, that's a very good possibility at where we are, and it's very likely to be the situation. Ordinarily, at this time of the year, this is end of January. Ordinarily, by now, we would be registering students. We're still writing exams, 2016 exams. So that's what I think. So we can let one or two people who have things to say to contribute to that, and then we can proceed to what we're supposed to do today. Yes.
What would be the first thing you change at UCT?
The first thing I would change at UCT? Yeah. I'll change all the names of the buildings. The second thing I would say is that there was a time in this country when the Afrikaners were lagging behind the English. What did they do to catch up with the English? They opened up the floodgates of higher education institutions. They even built their own institutions in order to catch up with the English. They did not say merit. At that time, all they said was that swim, if you get across, we would meet on that other side. If you don't, you don't. Why is it that today, when we have to manufacture black academics in critical numbers, everyone shouts merit? We know that what makes a good academic is not your marks. The marks you get in class are not what makes a good academic. If that was the case, I would never have become an academic. We know what makes good academics. It's good formative experience. Now, every time here we have to get black students into postgrad, everyone says standards and merits. They should think back a little. What did the Afrikaners do when they wanted to catch up with the English? They did not shout merit. No one at that point was shouting merit and standards. Something else happened. Why is it that when it has to happen now, the language changes? So the second thing I would change is I would ensure that we produce in large numbers black academics and black intellectuals. Because remember, the benefit of having black intellectuals is not just in terms of numbers. It's not just in terms of, accommodation. When you have black academics or black intellectuals, then a possibility exists for you to use education generally as a pivot for change. Intellectuals are not people found only in universities. Intellectuals are people who are found also in public institutions. One example. If you happen to visit Germany and you visit the German parliament, you can take a tour of the German parliament. When I had an opportunity to, the person who took us around had a PhD. That was just a tour guide around Parliament. That's the person who wrote a PhD on the Parliament itself, the building and the history of the institution. That's a public intellectual. But you know what's the benefit? It is that you then have a society that functions at a high level of efficiency and thought. Because when you have someone who has a PhD taking you round, first, the level of self-confidence, two, the level of efficiency, the level of depth, how enriched your experience is, then you have a society indeed that is able to project its standards at a very high level. Now what you have in South Africa is that people complain about a dysfunctional public service. Who goes to work in the public service? It is those who have had the worst education. So why do you expect the public service to function? It is people who barely made it through university. It is people who, by some chance were able to get through university. And those are the people who work in the public service. So why do you expect them to be efficient? Why do you expect them to be self-driven? Why do you expect them to be innovative and have initiative? But if you put people through proper education and they get out and they go to the public service and they are, functioning at the level of masters and PhDs, of course, that would translate also into how they do things. Now, who are the large numbers of people who work in the public service? It's black people. And so if you gave black people good education, it doesn't translate just to a benefit for themselves, it translates to a benefit for the whole of society. Because whether we like it or not, in the long run or in the long term, it's still going to be those black people who are going to be in the public service. So if you don't improve their education, don't expect the public service to improve. So that's the other thing I would change, but there are many things I would change if I were able to run a university. Yes?
If merit is a limiting factor at the moment, if so many people are not coming through at the other end and not getting their degrees, how will opening more of the floodgates to people who haven't got that so-called merit, how would they get through if they're already not according to what one reads?
The question is simple. Why don't people get through? Why don't people finish degrees? Half the number of people, black people who don't finish degrees, drop out for financial reasons. It's as simple as that. They come to UCT, they start the first year, the second year, they aren't able to pay, and then they leave. They have to drop out. So the point is not that people don't finish because they are not capable. No. But we also do know what makes a good academic. You see, as a third-year student, all you need in order to come back for an honors or come back for a master's if you're an honors student, you need a professor or someone in the academic staff to call you aside and say, I think you're good at it. I think you should come back. You are just a neophyte. You are an honors student or you are a third-year student. You are not sure of your capabilities. You need a senior person, you need a professor, or an academic calling you into his or her office and saying that, look, I think you'd make it as an academic. I think you should come back. Now, does that happen for black students in this institution? No. So when you say people don't get through to that other end, the reasons are not just their capabilities. The reasons are not just their capabilities. There are several other reasons why people don't make it to that other end. And, because then the next thing you're going to suggest that if it's merit that does not allow, to get through to graduating and to postgrad, you're going to suggest something that there's a coincidence between race and merit. Standards are not white, merit is not white. There's a reason why people, make it. Of course, the other reason is that there are some who come in better prepared than others. And so what do you do to those who come in less prepared than others? That's why I talk about, it concerns me that we take the best academics out of the classroom. Because a good academic and a good lecturer is able to tell, in class that, well, these students perhaps need some extra attention, and these students would make it at a goal. And so you treat your students according to their capabilities. Now, when you take an academic who's not sure of himself or herself yet, they're also trying to find their foot, and you put them into a first-year class. they can't go that extra mile and tell that, I have students here that need, further attention and whatnot. Because we have a system that incentivizes senior professors leaving the classroom and going to focus on research, But, the reasons are many. The point is that the reasons are many. The system is just dysfunctional. This system is just dysfunctional. It needs a complete overhaul with people who have not given up on the task of thinking. Thinking is hard, but it's not painful. We just have people who have given up on the task of creative thinking and thinking hard about how to engineer society. You have people who just, have measures and, who do things as though they just want to fulfill righteousness. Oh no, I tried, it didn't work, and they move on. We need people who are invested in the success of society. I think that's partly the problem. We have people who just tick boxes. How in this society there's someone who still gets a bonus, a performance bonus? This society is not functional. What have you done to earn a performance bonus? You have vice chancellors who are paid performance bonuses. What have they done? Really that justifies that. It tells you the level at which we expect, what our expectations are in this society. Our expectations are very low, such that, average people get through and become exceptional. I think that average people in this country turn into exceptional people, or when people have done what they are supposed to do, we thank them. When you say you want to work, you want to do something, do it. We don't have to thank you thereafter. You volunteered, you availed yourself and said, I want to be a vice chancellor. Do your work then. Don't then expect something more than that. But people pass with average performance and then they become exceptional. Because I think the bar for the acceptable in this country, we've dropped it rather too low. Yep.
You don't think that this problem of merit, let's put that aside, hasn't a lot to call on lower education, basic education? What children are, after 1994, we were going to improve all the schools, move as many black children into white schools as possible, because that would make the difference. What's happened is the schools have remained much the same, and the children, and as you say, the levels of do something average or exceptional, people get 10 A's in one trick, and they only used to get 2, and that was just as good in those days. But my question is, what do you think would improve in preparing children to become students, to develop their thinking mind, so that they could not just regurgitate facts, but actually engage with real thoughts?
You're quite right. We have to prepare students, but there's something that we must be attentive to. So you see, those schools, those Model C schools, that's what we're supposed to be good education. That's what we're supposed to constitute good schools. Now, my argument has been one. Thankfully, I no longer have to convince people that Model C schools are racist. Now, my point is that racism and good education cannot cohabit in the same place. You cannot have good education and racism in the same place. So part of the problem, which is what we're going to deal with today, is that what passes for good education in this country is actually racism. We've seen how this works in the area of language, today. Never mind the time, I'm going to, make up for it. Just as I'm able to extend it, I'm able to compress it. So the point is that even the primary and secondary education itself needs to be overhauled. It's not functional. And we must not delude ourselves and say that it's the public schools, even the private schools. 80% of black students who come to UCT come from those schools. So if the problem was public schools, at least white liberal institutions that attract black students from those schools, then they should at least, be saying that, no, wait, there's something different, at least in our institution. The black students that come into our institutions, do better because they've had good education. Which, by the way, is not to say that white students who come from those schools do well. It's the same thing. I find it odd these days, because we're going to talk about language. I find it odd these days that, not just these days, I've just become a lecturer, but I find it odd that you have people who say that English is their first language, but they can't write it. I can write English, I can speak English as a spoken language. There's something that it is not to me. It doesn't carry my emotions, it doesn't carry my culture. That part of it, I do not have. But language as a system is something that is accessible to everyone. Worst of all, if it's your first language, then you should do better. Language is that, organized body of thought that has its rules, its grammar and everything, is something that everyone has access to. But you find even people who are first, who are English speakers, or rather who have English as their first language, who can't speak, who can't write proper English. Now, so the problems are just, there are many. There are many, but it's not to say that they are without solutions. Solutions are there. I think we just aren't ready, partly because of the structure of this society. There is a defense of a certain era. There is a defense of certain spaces as if these are spaces of functionality, of efficiency, of merit, of good standards, when they are not. We should just acknowledge that white schools, black schools are just dysfunctional. What do we do about them? Manu, then we can get into.
You answered the question I have, but I have a comment.
Yeah, that's fine.
In Ghana, over the last few years, a number of private universities have been set up, and it's been a disaster. So at least government has made the right decision here not to allow private universities. They've drained resources from the public system, and the quality of the student, that every student university degree certificate is a passport to employment, but the quality is just not there. So don't go that way.
No, it won't work here. For several other reasons, but it just won't. Okay, so let's get on to the business of the day. So today we're going to look at, the works of a Kenyan scholar called Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is known as a novelist. Who's written quite a number of novels, including, what are Ngugi's novels? Sorry? The Grain of Wheat. Devil on the Cross, a play I will marry when I like, several. I mean, he has well over 20 novels and short stories. That's why, it's hard to recall. In fact, the mistake I often make is that I mix his titles either with Achebe's titles or Aikwe Ama's titles. So that's why I often. So Ngugi is quite an accomplished Kenyan scholar who's known mostly for his novels. But Ngugi was not just, has not always been a literary scholar. He comes from a department of English. So meaning that linguistics has also been his concern. So his concerns early on in his career was largely with language, and linguistics, if you wish. And so his early writings, tended to focus, as we've said, on the structure of language, but also they tended to focus on language, the politics of language itself, the language with which we write, as to what are the political implications, of language. Now, to make sense of Ngugi's ideas about language and decolonization, I think it will help to go back to his work, I think, which is published around the 1980s, Decolonizing the Mind. Now, in this book, Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi wa Thiong'o brings together 3 essays, one titled, or maybe not titled, but one concerned with the language of African literature, one titled with the language of theater, and the other titled with the language of the novelist. Now, what he does in these essays is to draw our attention to a long-standing debate within linguistics. Now, linguistics draws a distinction between language as a system. Linguistics draws a distinction between language as a system. Now, this distinction, I'll tell you secondly, what is the other category. This distinction is traceable to someone who's regarded as the father of the discipline of linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure. Now, here is an interesting thing about, Western thought that is very revealing. It is that this thing that is now assumed to be a characteristic feature of African societies is actually also a characteristic feature of European societies, patriarchy. All disciplines have fathers, they don't have mothers. Now, it seems like a passable thing. It simply suggests that these are societies for whom the male, figure was always at the leading front, where thought was supposedly an exclusive preserve for white males. And so if you look at all the leading Western thinkers, they are all male. Now, is that to suggest that women were not thinking in Europe at the time when Marx, when Hegel, when, Weber and all of those people were thinking? Of course they were thinking, but because of the patriarchal nature of the European society at the time, they were relegated. In fact, who's that writer who had to assume a different name in order to publish her novel? George, yes. So, Ferdinand de Saussure is the father of linguistics. We don't know who the mother is. But nonetheless, what language as a system is what Ferdinand de Saussure calls la langue in French. Then there is language There's language as communication. Or what Ferdinand de Saussure calls la. I don't speak French, so this I can't even take a chance in pronouncing. La parole. Is that, yeah? How do you pronounce it? Okay. So there is language as a system, no, and there's not as communication, but as if you wish, yeah, as a word. So there is a distinction between la langue, language as a system, and language as a word, or as communication, actually, yeah, that's right. So Ngugi draws this distinction and says that language as a system is different from language as communication. Now, what's the difference between language as a system and language as communication? Language as a system is precisely what we were speaking about, the formal aspect of language, that which you call, the phonetics of the language and the other rules, that govern that language. Now that part of language as system, la langue, is something that is accessible to everyone. So as an English speaker, you have access to other systems of language. The French, you can learn, French, that formal aspect of the language, and you can learn any other language. But there is language as communication. The reason I changed this is because I wanted to get to this part, that, there is language as communication, or language as well as a word, is not something that is an individual attribute. It's something that is collectively owned. So that aspect of language is a communal possession. It's something that belongs to the community of speakers. So as someone who can learn the formal aspects of English, the phonetics of English and every other system of English, there is something that I cannot access. It is this part of English, which is a communal collective, or rather which is a collective possession. Simply, this is language as a carrier of people's identity. This is language as something that tells you about a people's culture. Because in a moment we would see that there is a dynamic between language and culture, or there is a dialectic between language and culture. You cannot understand culture without language, just as it is that there is no culture without language. So there is that aspect. There are these two, aspects of language, according to Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This is an individual possession. Every individual can have that, can have access to that. But this aspect is collectively owned, or is a collective possession. And so it is much more than, it enables much more than communication. It enables much more than formal communication. Now what we're doing is formal communication. But there is a level of deploying language that does more than that, where you pass on to the next generation the culture of a people using language. Just as it is that in that process, as you pass on to a people or to the next generation, a culture, you are in that process enabling that culture to grow. So when you talk about culture, it is not something that is stagnant. It is something that evolves as people live, because culture emerges as human beings come into contact with nature. Culture is what enables people to manage or domesticate their encounter with nature. So culture provides them, with the rules of life generally, how they respond, to certain environmental, factors. So the point is, Ngugi says that any language has two systems, or rather has two aspects to it. It is the formal, system of the language that is an individual possession, but there is language as communication, or language as word, which is a collective, possession. This is what collectively defines a people. Now, Ngugi's point is simply this. It is that in all the colonies, there is something that happens to people who are colonized. It is that in their lives, or in their colonial lives, there is a disjuncture between the language they use at home in order to access the world, or so there's a disjuncture between this aspect of language and the language they use at school. So his point is simply that what colonialism does is to ensure that for the colonized, there is a disjuncture between language as a formal system and language as a collective possession. Because what happens to the colonized is that they are robbed of their languages. Colonialism ensures that they are robbed of their languages, and therefore on them are imposed the language of the colonizers. Now what does that mean? Which is what concerns Ngugi. It is that if you are a Zulu person, for instance, who goes to white schools and therefore loses Zulu as a language, what you then are left with is English as a formal language. What you then do not have is a language that immerses you into a cultural world. Because you no longer have Zulu that is supposed to immerse you into your own cultural world. You have English, but English that cannot take you into your cultural world. Because the culture of English is not your culture. So what you end up with is a people who are culturally alienated from their cultures, because it's an obvious thing that you cannot learn an Afrikaner culture through English. Just as it is that you cannot learn an English culture through Afrikaans. You need your own language in order to learn your culture, or in order to immerse yourself into your own culture. So what happens in the colonies is that you end up with people who only have the formal access to language, but who do not have access to language that also enables them to become a cultured people. So the colonized people everywhere, as Ngugi says, are a people who are devoid of culture. They are culturally empty and culturally alienated. And so their lives are lives of mimicry. Because then they go to English schools, they learn the English language, but they also then try to mimic the English culture. That's why then the black students who've gone to white schools, when they come to the university and meet people like us, who then tell them that their lives are lives of mimicry, then they become angry and take to the streets, realizing that they were actually fed with an education that alienates them from themselves. So, Ngugi's point is that language is much more than just a formal system of communication. Language is what enables people access their own culture. But so when people immerse themselves in their own culture, they do not just accept that culture and settle in it, they also enable that culture to grow. Because when they are in that culture through their language, societies develop, new developments happen, the language has to invent new words for new occurrences. But when people no longer think in their own languages, then their languages stagnate. And so their languages fall behind, and then over time they find that their languages are now inadequate for the modern world in which they live in. So for instance, when we claim that it is possible to be educated right up to matric in your native language, in Zulu, in Xhosa, and people say that, where is the vocabulary for science to come from? Where did the Chinese find the vocabulary from? Where did the Japanese find the vocabulary from? The vocabulary of a language is not something that sits somewhere. As new developments happen in society, because people speak their languages, they then have to invent names for things that did not previously exist. It's a sign of a language that has not been allowed to develop when it is unable to fully capture reality today. That's clear evidence that at a point that language was not allowed to develop with society. So the reason people tell us that we cannot have physics taught in isiZulu or in isiXhosa, it's clear evidence that our languages have not been allowed to evolve just as English has been allowed to evolve that vocabulary of medicine, that vocabulary of physics, that vocabulary, of. Otherwise, why is it that you can teach physics and medicine in Afrikaans? It is simply because the language has been allowed to evolve, whereas other languages have not been allowed to evolve. So colonialism ensures that the languages of the colonized become stunted, their growth is stunted, such that it then becomes possible to say at a later point that these languages are inadequate for modern life. So just a few years back, Stellenbosch was able to design a keyboard in Afrikaans. So now you have a computer that speaks Afrikaans. If today we were to demand that part of what needs to happen in South Africa is that you must have computers that speak isiXhosa or Tswana, it would be as though we are demanding the impossible. The first thing people would tell us is that where is that money going to come from? Where did the money to develop an Afrikaans keyboard come from?
The keyboard doesn't speak Afrikaans or even produce Afrikaans. It's just the letters may be rearranged so that you can type the words into Afrikaans, isn't it?
So what you want to suggest is that what exists in that technological world is language as a system. Now when you type in a computer, when you write an Afrikaans creative work with a keyboard that is in Afrikaans, what are you doing? You are delving into the second aspect of language. So when you have a keyboard that speaks isiZulu and then I ask you to write an essay in Zulu about the Zulu people, you then traverse these two worlds. You then bring these two worlds together, or these two worlds come together. These two worlds of language come together. So it's not just the formal. The keyboard is not just a formal thing. It doesn't just signify that formal aspect of language. It does more than that. Because then it enables people to think in their own languages. But also, the important point about language is that those for whom the language of education is both a formal system and a form of communication, what happens is that for those, they have a much more larger repertoire from which to draw, rather than those for whom the language of education is just a formal system. To put it more simply, if English is both a formal system to you and a form of communication, then if education is conducted in English, then you are going to be more proficient, you are going to be more creative, because you have a much deeper cultural repertoire from which to draw than me, who is not English in culture, who only has formal aspect to the language. And so your creativity in the education, if for you there is a confluence between these two aspects of language, your creativity is much more. Whereas for me, I through the perspective of a Kenyan writer called Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Let's try and address some of the questions that we have been postponing. One of which was, what was the relationship between what we did yesterday and student protest, and then the other question linked to that was, what do we foresee the year, to look like? Now, I see the question, what will the year look like in terms of student protest? When it was asked, it struck me as a very typically South African question. It's a typically journalistic question that journalists would ask at the end when they haven't really found an explanation for what they are trying to understand. So at the end they would say, so where do we go from here, or where to from here? The question or the point, as Ngugi says, in one of his novels, is not to look at where we fell. We must look at where the rain began to beat us. A very good evening. How are we today? I am well too. We're nearing an end, and now we're going to try slow things down a bit, and perhaps allow a bit more reflection. I suppose the 3 days has been too compact. So we would slow it down a bit and allow a bit of reflection. Deliberately, I postponed discussions so that at least we would have the basis for discussion, so that we don't discuss from, just from our pedestrian ideas about what happens in society. So before we get into today's subject, which is language and decolonization, not where we tripped and fell. Because, the question where to from here wants to then negate how we got to where we are. The answer to what will the year look like is self-evident if you think about what is the cause of these student protests. So the answer would simply be, have the underlying factors that have led to these student protests been addressed? Now, if they have been addressed, then there's reason to then say that, well, it would be expected of the students to now return to class, not disrupt, classes and not disrupt the academic year. But if the answer is that structurally everything remains the same, and in fact, if there is not even an intention, there is no sign of an intention to address the things that led to students protesting, then the answer has to be that the protest of necessity have to continue. And I suspect that as someone who lives and works here in this institution, there is very little that has changed since the students started protesting in 2015. One doesn't find in the institutional culture, one doesn't find in the structures of power, one doesn't find in the curriculum any movement from what was the situation in 2015. I often ask in my department, which is the Department of Politics, that you would expect that it would have, perhaps better than any other departments, the answers to the problems that the institution is facing. I often ask my colleagues, what has changed in the way in which you teach political science today and the way in which you taught political science in the 1980s? Absolutely nothing. It's the same thing that they taught to students in an institution that was exclusively white, that was racist. It's the same thing that they teach today. So, why would the students then have any reason to look forward to a peaceful academic year? So we have not given the students any reason to not want to disrupt the academic year, because even the attitudes, now what is even more worrying at UCT and in other institutions, is even the attitude that one gets in response to these student protests. The first response, knee-jerk response that people give to this protest is to mount what they think is a moral high ground and begin to point a finger at the students. How could you destroy, these institutions? Don't you have a sense of appreciation of what these institutions are doing for you? Now, that actually is to rub salt to the wound.